Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise and really pull out the crucial insights from a stack of sources, turning complex topics into clear, compelling understanding for you. Today, we're plunging into a really rich collection of material. We're covering the latest legal clashes, challenging government policy, surprising economic ripple effects from shifts in immigration, the intricate landscape of the U.S. economy, and even an early glimpse into future presidential ambitions.
Yeah, it's quite a journey we're taking. It connects the dots between these urgent judicial decisions, the actual prices you're seeing on the grocery shelf, the national debt, and, the political maneuvering that's already well underway for 2028.
Right. Our mission today is basically to give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed on these diverse yet deeply interconnected issues.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we're kicking things off with a really fascinating legal battle. It's just reached the Supreme Court, and it's shining a spotlight on a lesser-known process called the shadow docket. What exactly is the shadow docket, and I guess why should we care about this case? Well, the shadow docket. It refers to the Supreme Court's emergency orders and rulings. These are often made very quickly, sometimes in just days or even hours, and crucially, with minimal public scrutiny or, full argumentation like you see in regular cases.
Okay.
What's particularly striking here is just the speed, how fast this specific case escalated. It was brought by the American Federation of Government Employees and other unions, challenging President Trump's February executive order and an OMB memo.
Right. The ones calling for large-scale reductions in force, the RIFs.
Exactly. RFs across federal agencies.
And the unions aren't just worried about preparations. They're arguing that agencies are already, dismantling entire offices and firing half or more of all agency employees. That sounds pretty serious. So how did this end up at the Supreme Court's emergency door so fast?
Well, the district court initially granted a preliminary injunction, basically pausing these actions. But then the Ninth Circuit denied a stay request from the White House. So the administration, they bypassed the usual appellate process and took it straight to the Supreme Court for an emergency stay.
Wow.
And this kind of rapid escalation, it does raise questions about how different litigants, especially the government, can get such swift access to the court.
So on Tuesday, the Supreme Court granted that stay. It was a very brief order, just 2 paragraphs.
That's right, very brief.
And they actually stated that the executive order and the OMB memo were likely lawful, which put the preliminary injunction on hold. But does that mean they've decided the actual firings themselves are legal?
That's a really crucial point. No, the court was very explicit. They said, and I'm quoting here, "We express no view on the legality of any agency RIF and reorganization plan produced or approved pursuant to the executive order and memorandum."
Okay, so they allowed the order to stand, but they completely sidestepped the issue of the actual firings.
Precisely. So that means the legal fight over whether those RIFs are truly lawful, well, that's still very much alive. It's not settled.
And we know Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor voted with the majority. She wrote a concurrence, while Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson dissented. What were their main arguments?
Justice Jackson's dissent really zeroed in on the court majority's increasing reliance on the shadow docket.
Right.
She argues they're deciding major cases without knowing all the facts, without the full briefing process. This emergency docket, she says, it's meant for only the most rare and unique circumstances because, it lacks transparency and carries a higher risk of error.
And didn't she also make a point about the lower court?
Yes, that was her second point, that the district court, which actually heard the evidence and saw the witnesses, is really in the best position to evaluate the facts on the ground. And that court found evidence that RFs were indeed happening already, not just being planned.
I see. So what does Sotomayor say in her concurrence then?
Justice Sotomayor, well, she offered what some might see as maybe a small concession, a bone, perhaps, to the district court. She said they are free to consider those questions in the first instance regarding the actual RIFs.
Well, what does that mean practically?
Well, practically, it means more discovery, more review of detailed agency plans, more legal wrangling, further delays.
Right. And all while the actions the unions are challenging could potentially continue.
Exactly. The dismantling of these congressionally authorized agencies could keep going. The real insight here for you is how this shadow docket seems to be quickly becoming a major tool for significant policy shifts, potentially sidestepping the usual, more transparent debate and making it maybe harder to challenge government actions effectively.
Okay, from the complexities of Supreme Court emergency powers, let's shift focus now. We're looking at an area where policy decisions are having very real and sometimes pretty surprising consequences, especially in a sector as fundamental as agriculture.
Yeah, this next bit is interesting. Our sources introduce us to the Secretary of Agriculture, Rollins. Now, she has an impressive resume on paper law firm work, clerking for a federal judge, ran a right-wing think tank for 15 years.
Okay.
But what's notable, kind of jumps out, is that despite these qualifications, she hasn't really had a direct connection to agriculture itself in about 3 decades.
30 years. Wow. So that immediately raises questions, doesn't it, about how in touch she might be with the industry's day-to-day realities.
It certainly does, and this is where it gets particularly impactful for you listening at home. The Trump administration's immigration policy, well, it has numerous vulnerabilities, Achilles heels, as our sources put it.
Especially for key sectors like agriculture.
Exactly. Agriculture relies really heavily on affordable labor, and often that means undocumented workers. Without these workers, things like meat, milk, crops, they either won't make it to market or they're going to become vastly more expensive for everyone.
And are we already seeing effects?
We are, yeah. Workers, both undocumented and legal immigrants, are apparently increasingly failing to show up for shifts. On farms, dairies, meatpacking plants, basically out of fear of enforcement actions.
Which leads us to wonder, right, what happens to perishable goods, like you mentioned strawberries earlier, if they aren't harvested right on time?
They just rot. They rot in the fields. It's that simple and that potentially damaging to the food supply.
And we are already seeing grocery prices trend upward.
Yeah.
Our sources remind us the pandemic taught us it takes about, 3 to 4 months for these kinds of supply chain disruptions to fully show up in the prices we pay.
That's right. So the full impact might still be, working its way through the system.
Which brings us to what one source rather dramatically calls Fantasyland. Secretary Rollins' response.
Right, Fantasyland. So Secretary Rollins, responding proactively, stated pretty clearly there would be no amnesty for migrant workers. Okay. Instead, she suggested turning the problem into an opportunity.
An opportunity.
By asserting that Medicaid recipients will now have plenty of work available to them in agriculture.
Okay, wait. Replacing experienced farm labor with Medicaid recipients. Our sources pointed out some significant critiques of that plan, didn't they?
They certainly did. Several big ones. First, the wages. Farm work wages are generally just not acceptable to the vast majority of Americans. It's low pay.
And second?
Second, it's incredibly hard, physical labor, back-breaking work, often in difficult conditions. So the overlap between the group of people who genuinely need Medicaid and the group of people physically able and willing to do intense farm labor for low wages is likely very, very small.
Makes sense. And there was a third point, too, about the big, beautiful bill.
Yes. It's argued that the whole point of the Big Beautiful Bill, which seems to be the administration's signature economic initiative, though details are a bit murky, was actually meant to remove people from the Medicaid system, probably to fund tax cuts, not to compel them into strenuous farm work. It seems contradictory.
So the administration faces a looming problem here, and not much time.
Very little time. The Rollins plan, as described, risks serious price shocks, like eggs jumping to $10 a dozen. That's the kind of figure being thrown around.
Ouch. What's the alternative?
The alternative would be to, adjust policies somehow to keep the current agricultural workers on the job. And interestingly, President Trump himself has apparently hinted at something along those lines.
But that creates a communication challenge, doesn't it? Trying to send two messages at once.
A huge challenge. How do you communicate, we are cracking down hard on immigrants, and also, hey, immigrants, don't worry, we won't come round you up at your essential farm job? It's tricky.
Yeah.
Our sources also mention a recent ICE raid in Los Angeles. Reportedly, it detained no one but did disrupt summer camps. Maybe an indicator that even these high-profile raids are yielding less in terms of actual detentions or perhaps getting less attention. It's hard to say for sure.
So this whole situation, it really highlights the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of policy and how it directly impacts your everyday life, like right down to your grocery bill.
Absolutely. It's a clear connection.
Okay, let's transition now to the broader economic picture. We need to talk about U.S. fiscal health, inflation, monetary policy. Our sources pull together insights from financial experts, Chris Whalen and Keith, from a recent meeting, July 2025.
Right. And maybe to set the stage, it helps to look at the historical context of U.S. debt, just for a moment.
Okay.
For the first 150 years of the country, up until about 1940, the national debt actually never went above 45% of GDP.
Never above 45%.
Okay. Then World War II caused a huge spike up to 112%, but impressively, it fell back down to 45% again by 1960.
Wow, that's quite a swing back. So where are we now?
Well, fast forward to today, and the U.S. faces a, frankly, staggering $40 trillion in outstanding debt.
40 trillion.
And get this. What used to be considered a significant annual deficit, maybe 1.5% to 2% of GDP, that level is now just the expected annual rate of increase in the debt.
So the rate of increase today is what used to be the whole deficit. That really puts it in perspective.
It does. And the deficit projections are also pretty concerning. New legislation, like that big, beautiful bill we keep mentioning,
Right.
is expected to materially increase deficits by an average of 1.5% of GDP per year between 2026 and 2029.
And the biggest jumps are soon.
Yeah, the largest increases are forecasted for 2026 and 2027. The deficit could rise from 5.5% to 7.0% of GDP in 2026, and from 5.2% up to 7.0% again in 2027. These are numbers we typically only see during major crises like deep recessions or wars.
Okay, so debt and deficits are a big concern. What about inflation? Is it cooling off?
While inflation remains stubbornly high and sticky, that's the phrase our sources use. Demand-driven core PCE inflation, that's personal consumption expenditures, the measure the Fed watches closely, it's elevated, and there are really no clear signs of rapid disinflation, of it coming down quickly.
Sticky, like even rent expectations are high.
Exactly. Even one-year rent price expectations are high, and that really contributes to the stickiness. It makes it harder for overall inflation to fall back to target.
So where are the projections heading?
Well, headline CPI, the Consumer Price Index, its year-over-year growth peaked above 8% back in 2022. It is projected to moderate, but, and this is key, it's expected to remain above the Federal Reserve's 2% target all the way through 2026.
Still above 2% through 2026, so hovering around.
Hovering around maybe 2.5% to 3.0% in the coming years, which really prompts the question, is the Fed's current strategy, keeping rates high, truly working as intended, or is it maybe too restrictive now?
And some experts think the Fed waited too long or should have cut rates earlier.
Yes, some argue they should have cut rates earlier. They view the current policy rates as punitive, too high. They suggest an ideal Fed funds rate might be more in the low 4% to high 3% range.
But cutting rates isn't without risk either, right? What happens if they cut too quickly?
That's the dilemma. Cutting rates too quickly carries significant risks. It could steepen the yield curve. That's the relationship between short-term and long-term interest rates.
Right.
And that could cause mark-to-market losses for banks, meaning the value of assets on their books falls. It could destabilize things.
And Jerome Powell's future adds another layer.
Yeah, Jerome Powell, the current Fed chair, he may remain as a Fed governor until his term ends in 2028, even if he isn't reappointed as chairman when that term is up. So that adds both some continuity, but also maybe a degree of uncertainty to future policy direction.
Okay, let's talk real estate.
Yeah.
That affects so many people directly. The Fed's policies during COVID drove prices way up. What's happening now?
Well, now it's a different story. Mortgage volumes are down significantly, maybe 20–25% year over year.
Wow.
And because rates went up so much, refinancing options are really limited for most people. It means many homeowners are essentially locked in to their current mortgages, even if they'd like to move or refinance.
Okay, that's residential. What about commercial real estate?
In commercial real estate, we're seeing clear deflationary pressures, things losing value, especially in private equity and private credit sectors that invest heavily there. Interestingly, that 2% inflation target the Fed aims for, it's actually seen by some in the industry as sort of a minimum requirement for commercial real estate to function properly.
Why is that?
Because property appreciation, prices going up at least a little, is pretty essential for refinancing deals and extracting cash in that market. Without appreciation, deals can fall apart.
Amidst all these challenges, debt, inflation, real estate woes, gold has quietly surged, up 27% this year. Why is gold doing so well?
Well, gold is really gaining status again as a reserve asset. You see central banks, particularly in places like China and Russia, actively accumulating it.
Interesting.
It's even become legal tender now in over 15 U.S. states, and it's being used more frequently in contracts. It underscores its traditional role as a hedge against inflation and, broader economic uncertainty. People get nervous. They look to gold.
Okay, so looking at policy implications. The administration's aggressive approach on tariffs, international relations, that's seen as both risk and opportunity.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, according to these sources. Risk, obviously, from trade wars or alienating allies. But opportunity. There's talk about the potential to manage the U.S. government's massive balance sheet more like a business does,
Oh, so.
by maybe leveraging the trillions in assets held by the Treasury and the Federal Financing Bank more effectively. It's an idea that's out there.
And the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Besson. What's the view on him?
He's viewed pretty favorably, actually, by the experts cited in our sources, seen as open to thoughtful analysis and potentially someone who could genuinely drive some deficit reduction.
So wrapping up the economy, the big picture seems to be this complex interplay between fiscal policy, government spending, and taxes, the Fed's actions on interest rates, and, of course, political leadership, all shaping the economic outcomes for you in the years ahead.
That sums it up well. It's all connected.
Okay, finally, let's shift our gaze to politics. Specifically, the political maneuvering that's already underway for the 2028 presidential race. And we're focusing here on California Governor Gavin Newsom. What's the earliest sign he's positioning himself?
Well, it's quite clear, isn't it? Newsom's intentions seem far from subtle, according to our sources. He's going to be term limited as governor in 2026.
Right, which frees him up.
Exactly. Frees him up to campaign full-time starting in 2027. And his strategy for a presidential run, it's described as having basically three main prongs.
Okay, prong one. You mentioned positioning himself as a leader of the anti-Trump resistance. Why is he particularly well suited for that role?
He's well positioned mainly because President Trump himself often singles out California as sort of an enemy state, right?
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
So this gives Newsom a natural platform. He can initiate legislation in California, file lawsuits, generally work to frustrate the White House's agenda. It helps solidify his image as a key counterforce to Trumpism.
Okay, makes sense. Prong two involves shedding that California liberal label, trying to reinvent himself as more of a centrist. How's he attempting that? Seems like a stretch for a California governor.
Well, yeah. He's been hosting some, let's say, unexpected guests on his podcast. Our sources call them pretty odious right-wingers, people like Charlie Kirk, Steve Bannon, Dr. Phil McGraw, even Michael Savage.
Wow, that's quite a list, all in the name of dialogue.
Apparently so,
Oh.
all in the name of dialogue. And he's also taken some stands on culture war issues that are described as litmus test failing for traditional Democrats. Most notably, opining that trans girls should not compete in girls' sports.
Ah, okay. So clear moves to broaden his appeal, or at least muddy the waters on his ideology.
Exactly. Trying to reach voters who might normally tune out a California liberal.
And the third prong, this is the specific news hook, right? He's actually getting started on the ground.
Yes, the nuts and bolts stuff. He's currently touring South Carolina.
South Carolina, okay, what's he doing there? And why South Carolina specifically?
Well, while he's there, he's apparently displayed a newfound love of Scripture, specifically citing Corinthians, something our sources note his California constituents weren't really aware of, during a meeting with hundreds of African Methodist Episcopal bishops.
Interesting timing for that.
Isn't it? He's also been rubbing elbows with key Democratic movers and shakers there. Representative Jim Clyburn, a very influential figure.
Hugely influential, especially with black voters in South Carolina.
Right. Clyburn joined Newsom at some town halls and even said publicly, "I feel good about his chances." That's a significant nod.
So what's the official reason for the trip? Is he just vacationing?
Oh no, officially, Newsom's trip is framed as supporting communities hit hard by natural disasters and also by Medicaid cuts.
Okay, but what can a governor from California realistically do about those issues in South Carolina from his current job? That part was left unexplained.
Completely unexplained. Everyone knows what's really going on, right? It's much like Ron DeSantis making trips to Iowa back in 2023. It's early campaigning.
So why the intense focus on South Carolina so early? You mentioned Clyburn, but is it just luck? Or is there more strategy there? Maybe because Iowa and New Hampshire's status in the primary calendar is kind of up in the air for the Democrats.
That could definitely be part of the calculation. South Carolina is seen as a crucial early state, especially for proving viability with black voters, who are a cornerstone of the Democratic base. Iowa and New Hampshire, their early status is in flux within the party. So maybe Newsom thinks South Carolina is a better place to make his first big impression, a more reliable early test. His actions certainly suggest a calculated bet on the state's importance in the 2028 primary landscape.
So what Newsom's early moves really show us, it's like a blueprint, isn't it, for how future presidential campaigns might operate. It's not just about policy stances anymore. It's this deliberate blend of resistance, reinvention, and that crucial grassroots outreach, all starting long, long before the official campaign clock even starts ticking.
Exactly. It's a fascinating look into the long game of presidential politics.
Okay. Well, we've certainly navigated some complex terrain today. We went from the nuances of the Supreme Court's shadow docket and its, profound impact on federal agencies.
Right, to those unexpected connections between immigration policy and what you pay at the grocery store.
Yeah, and the pressing challenges of U.S. debt and sticky inflation.
And finishing with that very early jockeying for the 2028 presidential race.
Looking at the broader implications, it just powerfully highlights how deeply intertwined everything is, isn't it? Our legal, economic, and political systems decisions in one area inevitably ripple through the others.
Often in unforeseen ways. Yeah, it's all connected.
And that's our deep dive for today.
So here's maybe a final thought for you to mull over. In this era where information and policy seem to shift at dizzying speeds, how might this increasing reliance on, say, rapid-fire judicial actions like the shadow docket or the ripple effects of seemingly unrelated economic pressures, how might that fundamentally reshape the very fabric of governance in your daily life?
Yep.
Could it create really unexpected outcomes that challenge our conventional understanding of cause and effect? Something to think about.